All right, so the big way that we're shaking the combat up this time around is basically like adding space and time, which sounds really presumptuous. Here's what we're doing. We're basically letting you move around this time in the fractured butthole, so you can actually fight in the same places that you're walking around in. The thing you get almost for free when you add that kind of movement and that kind of space is like a lot of like depth and strategy with very little like additional cost. Like people get it. Oh, I get it. I can run over to this side and like hit this guy from behind, or I can run over back here and stay at range so they can't find me. And then in terms of time, what we're doing is we're adding a whole lot to like turn order, and like you've got a little timeline, and it actually makes a huge difference who goes first and who goes after them. And we give you a few verbs for actually like messing with that timeline. So once you think that you understand combat, suddenly we introduce the concept of time farts. We introduce like all these other things you can do to push people around in time to kind of set up your perfect combo. And the whole goal wasn't just to add, like new rules for rules' sake. The whole point was to make it so that when you're playing hour 5, hour 10, it's not the same experience as you were having at the very beginning of the game. It's still fresh because there's always a new scenario. There's always like a new space you can be fighting in and some new thing you can do to push these characters around. Repetition is the death of anything funny. Each combat, because you're on a grid and you're moving around, is going to take longer than Stick of Truth, but you can still get through like the kind of like run-of-the-mill 6th grader combats fairly fast. And what we're going to end up doing is a lot of like behind-the-scenes work to kind of like, make it so the second or third time you see something, like we shorten it up a little bit. But honestly, like, we think that the pace feels better than when it's not just kind of like hit somebody twice and you're done. It just means that it's going to be chunkier. So you're going to get more exploration, more plot, and then a battle, and then more exploration, more plot, and then a battle, as opposed to it being like really quick and peppered. You can end up fighting as much living town battle stuff as you want, but a lot of the battle is either avoidable or mitigatable in some way so that you can, like essentially spend as much time as you want to, or if you want to just barrel down the main line of the plot, you can. Yeah. You're playing superheroes, right? And superheroes don't run around with swords in their hands. So while you're still changing your costume up and like looking how you want to look, you actually have way more freedom when it comes to like picking which things define your playstyle. You're doing a lot less of just, yep, okay, that is a strength +5 build, right? And it's more like, how do I want to play? I want to play more actiony. I want to play with a lot of knockbacks. So if you want to end up pushing your team to where you're actually really good at like the Twitch gaming and you want to hit all those action moments, you can gear towards that. If you want to play like a support character, you can gear towards that. And that's just the equipment side of things, right? The real big, huge change is that you're not just picking a class at the beginning of the game and saying, that's it, that's my next 20 hours. Instead, you're like workshopping who your character is, what your backstory is, and how you play through the entire game with Cartman. But the real meaty, chunky decisions that you're making are what powers you bring in. Since you can bring up to 4 in for, your main character, like that's a lot of different combinations. You can essentially, at any time when you're not in the middle of a combat, pull open this little app on your phone and say like, no, actually, I do have laser eyes because my grandma, drank radioactive waste. And so we're calling it the hero DNA system. So essentially your choices are essentially like fictionally who your grandparents were, because it always skips a generation. So you go to this app and essentially go like, yep, my grandma was Spider-Man, my dad, my grandfather was Superman, but my other grandfather, yeah, he's a rock. They make the game easier or harder or take away a rule or add a rule. Again, we didn't want to ignore players who are actually like really into RPGs and strategy and tactics, and like there's enough meat on the bones of this game to like make that worth their while. You can turn a bunch of these modifiers on and make the game way harder for yourself. And essentially, the harder you make the game, the better chance you have of earning what we call prestige loot. Both of these guys are, like Matt and Trey, they're super savvy gamers, and Trey especially is more weighted towards the strategy board game RPG end of the spectrum. I think really most of the kind of like pressure to keep it from getting too deep and tactical came from our side. Most RPGs, I mean, I love that genre to death, but they assume that you've already been playing them for 16 years. And we want everybody who's seen the show to be able to actually play this. Give us depth, but don't put rules in for rules' sake. Don't do anything invisible. Put it all on the screen. It didn't click for them until they saw people arranged on this big grid and went, oh, I see, he's in line with this guy, and now I get it. Now I know what I can do and what I can't do. Because before, when it was continuous space, those edges were very fuzzy. And like maybe if you're, again, a game designer or a game developer, you'd be like, okay, no, I get it. It's Skulls of the Shogun. I played something like this before. But again, for somebody who hasn't, just being able to go like, oh, I get it. Okay, it's space, but everybody has their place, and there's rows and columns, and I can do this. It's like a crossword. That was the moment where everything clicked into place. Oh, I love it. It's easily my favorite thing. We're all here because we're fans of the South Park universe, but being able to make a cool RPG combat system that I can actually like show to everybody I know and actually have them play, as opposed to just, yep, that would be really cool if I had 3 years to go learn every other RPG on the market and then come to this one. And because the setting is so different from your standard kind of fantasy or sword and sorcery thing, like there's so much more play, like things that would be not allowed in other games you can just do, right? Because again, it's South Park, it's a comedy game, you can just kind of make things happen. I mean, I've designed RPG systems for games that are not actually RPGs. BioShock Infinite, I worked on some of the Ratchet and Clank games. This is the first one that is like, yep, nothing but that, and all the action is the add-on, as opposed to the RPG being the flavor that gets inserted into other games. We started, I'd say, in more of like a dense board game or XCOM place, and then just kind of put it all up on the board and said, which of these things is actually adding to fun and depth, and which of these things are just assumed because that's the way that these things have always been done. So it would always be like, hey, like XCOM, but, Skate. Or, like, again, very strange combinations. But, some Fire Emblem and Destiny. Basically, I mean, if you have a group of designers worth their salt, right, you're trying to not just kind of rely on your own experience, but also be able to say provable things to your team before you ask them to go spend a year of their life on something, right? With RPGs, that's even easier because, again, if you're doing your jobs right, you can take these systems and essentially like turn them into something that you can just play right there. So that's exactly what we did. We've got a grid, we've got these characters, so we actually made a big old like paper map and ended up trying out pretty much like I'd say 50, maybe 60% of our scenarios on paper before they even got into the video game. If we didn't like a rule in the board game, we just changed it right there. Like there's no friction. So it gave us a huge amount of confidence walking into the rest of the game, saying like, actually, we played these from a strategic point of view, and we already had fun. So go forth, we know what we're doing. And that's a very powerful thing to be able to say. I want them to remember the jokes, but immediately after that, I would love them to say like, man, that was deep. I don't need arcane, I don't need tactical or like stat driven. I just want them to go like, there was some depth there. I had to figure that one out, and I didn't think I could do it because I'm not usually that type of player, but this time I got it right.